Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much indeed for coming on this miserable afternoon. My name is Steve Tinney, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Penn Museum. Tonight's installment of the Greats Lectures, again, is sold out. It's a very special thing. This year, of course, our theme is the rise of the city, to tie in with the opening of our new Middle East galleries in April 2018. We've selected speakers and topics which give us kind of a 360-degree view of how cities come into being and what they are and how they function, their history, and so on. We are now barely a month from the opening of the Middle East galleries, and I can tell you there's a growing excitement in the museum. We're all confident. If you're not a member, this would be a great time to join the museum, because we have a series of events running up to the opening and through the opening week and so forth. There'll be a lot of hoopla here, so please make sure to pay attention to your emails and to the mailings that come in the post, and whatever else you get, however else you get in touch with you, and come and enjoy the opening of these new signature galleries, which are a huge event for us. The next lecture in our series will be on March 7th, and will feature Dr. Nancy Steinhardt, Professor of East Asian Art and Curator in the Asian section here in the Penn Museum. Nancy will be talking on the topic, The Forbidden City, Emperors, Ritual, Residence, and City. As usual this evening, after the lecture, there'll be time for questions, which will be moderated by our speaker. There'll be a microphone going around so everybody can hear the questions as well as the answers. So now, almost for the part you've all been waiting for, but just before the part you're really waiting for. Dr. Kathleen D. Morrison is the Sally and Alvin V. Shoemaker Professor of Anthropology in the Anthropology Department here at Penn, and a curator in the Asian section. Kathy just joined us a little over a year ago, and we were thrilled to be able to woo her here from the University of Chicago to take up the chair at Penn. It's really an immense pleasure to be able to introduce Kathy, our most recent curatorial appointment in the museum, to all of you this evening. Kathy holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of California, Berkeley, an MA from the University of New Mexico, and a BA from the University of Notre Dame. So she's worked in a wide variety of urban environments. Her research focuses on the historical ecology of Southern Asia, especially changes in agriculture, land use, and environment, integrating approaches from archaeology, history, and environmental science. This is realized in a dizzying array of projects, including work on the long-term relationships between biodiversity and human land use, a big data project named Land Cover 6K, which uses archaeological, historical, and paleo-environmental evidence to improve climate models, network and spatial analysis of middle period South Indian inscriptions and archaeological sites, and ongoing work on the archaeology of farming, food, and power relations in South India from the Neolithic to the modern period. All of these projects, and more, if you can believe that, are featured in the lengthy list of publications and talks which comprise her impressive CV. So now I invite you to welcome Kathy and enjoy what I know is going to be a fascinating talk on India's city of victory, social worlds and survival in a semi-arid megalopolis.
So Steve, did you hit the right switch? Or did you forget? Okay, no switches. We're very good. Thank you for coming out this evening, as Steve said. I'm delighted to be here at Penn. And I'm delighted to have a chance, too, and to talk in this Rise of the City series about a city that not many people have heard of, particularly people in the U.S. And it's the city of Vijaynagar, a name which means City of Victory, in southern India. And this is a city that I first visited in 1985 as a graduate student. And I went to work with John Fritz and George Michel, George Michel being one of the most eminent architectural historians of South Asia. And I went, like most of you perhaps, or maybe I'm not giving you credit, not really knowing much about this place I was going. It's a place popularly known as Hampi, a UNESCO World Heritage Monument in the state of Karnataka in southern India. But in its day, between the 14th and 16th centuries CE, it was one of the largest cities in the world, and certainly the largest city in Asia. It was a huge place, and it's possessed of, really quite remarkable architecture. So I spent many years working with John and George and their team documenting standing architecture in the city, and learning from them, and then in future years on my own projects about the organization of agricultural production, about the lives of both elite and non-elite people in and around this great city and part of the empire that it was the capital of. So Vijayanagar is the name of the city, and it's also the name of the empire. In 1900, Robert Sewell, a British colonial officer, wrote a book called The Forgotten Empire about Vijayanagar, because in his view, nobody knew what this was. In India, most people have not forgotten this empire, but it is really remarkable in some ways the extent to which this, the history of this place has been underplayed. On the map on the right, you can see the major world powers. So around the 14th and 15th century then, the major powers of the world were the Ottoman Empire, which I know you've heard of. What if we just turn this one off? Oh, cool. Okay. I mean, I don't have to wear it then, right? Okay, much better. I always hate those things anyway. Okay, the Ottoman Empire in green, the Safavids in kind of a pinkish color, and the Mughal Empire in purple. A little bit before this, they're a predecessor to the Mughal Empire. But Ibn Battuta, who was one of the most interesting kind of world explorers, he was a Muslim legal expert from Morocco. Ibn Battuta, whose travels you can see in the map on the upper left, took off from his home in Morocco in 1325 and didn't get back home until 1354. He was one of the most incredible sort of traveling hucksters. He managed to insinuate himself into positions of power wherever he went. In his writings, which are really quite fascinating, Battuta argued that the four major powers in the world at the time that he knew it were the Ottomans, the Safavids, the Mughals, and the Vijayanagar kingdom, or the Vijayanagar Empire. And somehow, in a way, even in this map I pulled from the internet, I put a little red circle down at the bottom, you can see the Vijayanagar Empire is labeled, but it doesn't actually get any color of its own. Very sad for something I spent so much time studying. So it's a very significant part of the world, but one that I think, still needs to work on its press. Okay. So this is a map, a very kind of impressionistic map, to be sure, of the area controlled by the Vijayanagar Empire. They even made some forays down into the northern part of Sri Lanka. And the area I'm going to talk about today is that dot in the center. That dot is the capital city, the eponymous capital city, city of Vijayanagar, the same place that is also popularly known now as Hampi, as a tourist destination and as a pilgrimage site. And you can see that the city is situated way up at the northern edge of the empire. And this is very much an important part of its fate in the story I'll talk about today. So this is an empire that was built really very rapidly by a small regional kingdom, which expanded out of this semi-arid, resource-poor region to conquer many of the rich agricultural areas of southern India and some of the large and valuable temple towns and resources of the more well-watered parts of the peninsula. So the capital city, that little dot right there, was occupied for around 300 years, between about 1300 and 1565. And after it was abandoned in 1565, and I'll just wait because someone will definitely ask me why, it was never reoccupied. This makes it one of the most amazing kinds of locations for archaeologists. Archaeologists hate it when people come back to places or continuously occupy them. It's very nice when they go away and they leave behind a kind of, a complete infrastructure for us to study. And that's precisely what this area is like. So we have a 300-year occupation. It was abandoned for a more secure location further south in the empire. And I went in the 1980s to work on documenting the architectural remains on the surface of this city. And I want to talk a little bit about the city itself, and then to talk a little bit about the work we did after that on the countryside surrounding it. So doing this kind of architectural documentation is something like this. It's something like taking the jumble of walls and rocks and alignments and so on, and some beautiful standing buildings that you see on the left, and turning them into more like something on the right. Plans, photographs, drawings, and descriptions. And I did that for quite a long period of time. And that's formed the basis of the further project. So the empire itself then, thinking beyond the city itself, one thing we know about the Vijaynagar Empire is that it was very much a cosmopolitan empire. Although the kings and the rulers of the Vijaynagar Empire were themselves Hindus, the population that they ruled over was multi-religious. There were Hindus, there were Muslims, there were Jains, there were Jews, a few Christians, and multiple denominations, let's say Hindu denominations. So it was a very diverse place. In a large empire like that, it was also a multilingual empire. It's an area where primarily South Indian languages were spoken, Kannada, Telugu, Tamil, Malayalam, but then also Sanskrit was used as a kind of courtly language and a language of scholarship. It was an area that was incredibly diverse ethnically, with people who were very educated poets and priests and so on, and in the mountain areas, various kinds of small-scale agriculturalists and tribal people, some of whom were practicing hunting and gathering. So it was an incredibly diverse world that was wielded together by this kind of very quickly emergent empire that comes from this resource-poor, kind of small, kind of, crappy little place in central Karnataka. This is also an empire in which Indian citizens have a great deal of pride. So it may be a forgotten empire in the West, but it's certainly not a forgotten empire in South Asia. Here you can see a stamp, an official government stamp, with it showing a famous sculpture of one of the most well-known of the Vijayanagar emperors, Krishnadeva Raya from the early 16th century was an intrepid intrepid empire builder, a warrior, also a major patron of temples, constructed a lot of temples, wrote poems. He's just, all-around wonderful guy. And one thing I want you to notice here about this stamp, just put this on the back burner for a moment, is his little hat. Okay, it's not actually a little hat. This is his tall, pointy hat. Okay, so keep in mind his hat. So this empire then was a place that, in a way, had to build a kind of ideology of rule, a kind of recognition of its place in the universe very quickly. And one of the ways in which this was done was by bringing together multiple kinds of pre-existing modalities of rule, of justification, of legitimacy and empire. One of those, as we'll see in some detail, was Hindu historical traditions which posit certain kinds of important rules for kings. Kings should be very generous. Kings should patronize, especially Hindu temples, but all religious institutions, and Brahmins. Kings should be valorous in war. Kings should be virile and have many wives and concubines. Kings should have a good grasp of poetry and many other kinds of things. So there's the kind of sets of pre-existing, let's call them Hindu idioms that the Vijayanagar rulers drew on, but at the same time, they lived in a very cosmopolitan world where many of the neighboring polities had rulers who were Muslims, and again, with cosmopolitan populations underneath them. So they also drew, as we'll see, on some of those kinds of traditions as well. Let's go into the city right now and look at some of the kind of monumental architecture that we find in sort of downtown Vijayanagar. This is part of the area known as the Royal Center. And I just want to show you a few examples of some of the kinds of structures that we find there and how they operated or how they worked in terms of the operation of the state and of the empire. This is a massive platform known as the Mahanavami platform. The Mahanavami ceremony is a major religious ceremony which is held every year. It has a kind of contemporary ancestor or contemporary descendant in the Dasara festival that the state of Mysore holds every year. And at this festival, the subsidiary leaders, the subordinate rulers, would come in front of the king, in front of the emperor, to present their tribute. Now, it doesn't, maybe I put a few people on it. I picked one with people to give you a sense of it. It doesn't maybe look as grand as it might because it's simply the foundation for something that would have had a complicated ephemeral superstructure, probably of tents and poles and things like that. You can see this is the side of, one of the sides of the Mahanavami platform. You've got a balustrades in the front of a staircase going up. Something of the importance and the kind of self-representation of the Vijayanagar state as a cosmopolitan linked place and also as a place of martial significance. So if you can see to the left of the elephant and a little bit up, there are several camels there. Camels are a kind of animal you find in northwest India. You definitely don't find them in southern India. So it's a kind of exotic beast brought in. Horses are also very prominently displayed in these kinds of motifs. And we know that the southern Indian rulers relied quite heavily on cavalry. It was a kind of innovation, warfare innovation at the time. But horses don't breed very well in southern India. So South Indian rulers were very much dependent on horses from the Gulf, brought in by various kinds of merchants, especially after 1498 by Portuguese merchants. So the Portuguese and the beginnings of their imperial overseas Asian empire were important, have an important role to play in our story as well. So we have horses, we have camels, and we have elephants. Elephants, again, play a very important role in both royal display and in warfare. These are the royal elephant stables in the royal center. There's not a lot of room for elephants here. You can probably put 1 to 2 elephants. There's been some little research, walking the temple elephant in there, which was very cute because the temple elephant's a baby, to check it out. But this is where really the prime elephants would be placed. So the hundreds, if not thousands, of royal war elephants were kept in camps around the outside of the city. And one thing you should know about elephants is that they are very, very hungry animals. They eat a lot. They eat even more than my 14-year-old son, I dare say. And they are therefore, in a way, a huge burden on those who receive them, right? I'm sure we've all heard the term white elephant, right? In the sense of a gift that you don't really want to receive, right? So supporting an elephant and all its needs is a tremendous investment of resources, and it's also a very important statement about royal power and authority. And the role of elephants is partly for display, because you look cool when you're riding an elephant, but also for war. And here you can see a sculpture of an elephant in war, tearing an enemy limb from limb. And behind this poor elephant are some of its keepers prodding it with, iron things to make it kind of crazy. Of course, the difficulty with war elephants is they also sometimes turn on you, and they can't always be controlled. But it's really must have been quite the spectacle. Okay. This is another sculptural panel that I just want to show you again from the Royal Center. It's on the outside of a temple, the Ramachandra Temple, which was a private temple of the Vijayanagar kings. And here you can see some encircled in red, bound captives being presented to a royal figure of some sort, scenes of hunting in between, and armies marching down below. So there's really no doubt that, in part, the Vijayanagar Empire, this very lightning-fast constructed empire, was built on military conquest in the first instance. Okay. But military conquest doesn't necessarily allow you to maintain or administer an empire, and to that end, various other kinds of strategies were followed. So I mentioned before the way in which the rulers of this new city and new kingdom, because the city itself has a relatively short time period, 300 years, it's a relatively short lifetime, drew on two kinds of idioms. One were the kind of pan-regional idioms of rule that it took in various kinds of what's been called Islamicate forms of practice. The other are more long-standing Hindu and kind of religious traditions of gift-giving and particularly of the exchange of foodstuffs. So starting in about the 15th, 16th century, in South Indian temples, the nature of worship shifted to a certain extent away from offerings to God of valuables like lamps and musical instruments and things, more and more to the offering of gods of food. So Hindu gods in this period and now are really meant to be, are instantiations of the deity, and they're living creatures. So they get up in the morning, they get dressed, they take a bath, they have their breakfast, they get married, they have birthdays, and so on. And it's the responsibility of the priests in the temple to maintain that, right? So giving gifts of food to gods is very much parallel of giving gifts of land and food to political allies as a mode of political justification. So here you can see actually a painting, sorry, it looks a little blurry from up here, but I hope it looks better back there, from the 17th century. It's actually after the Vijaynagar period of the successor states called the Nayakas, of religious leaders eating from banana leaves on the Nayaka's palace in Madurai. So remember the banana leaves, okay? We're going to come back to that. So here we have a kind of religious leaders being ceremonially feasted, which shows what a good leader this Nayaka is, okay? And then also a kind of auspicious Rangoli design that you'll still see today on the doorways of almost every South Indian home. It was the housewife's job is to make a little design, and this is made from rice powder. So remember the banana leaves, remember the pointy hat, and remember the rice, okay? So this kind of feasting and gifting to temples and to Brahmins is not something which is simply ancient history, right? So it didn't take me very long to find a picture of feasting of Brahmins as part of a contemporary religious ceremony. So this is something which has a powerful salience in Hindu tradition, particularly in South India. So at this time, we see that temples, and I'll show you some nice temple photos in a minute, emerge not just as small places of worship for private people or sort of individuals, but more as these vast sprawling complexes. Hindu practice is not necessarily congregational in the sense that large groups of people are brought together in worship. Worship may be more dispersed throughout the day, but these are huge temple complexes which were in the historic record marked as cities in their own right. And they controlled quite a significant amount of agricultural land and resources, had their own kitchens, their own warehouses, and also quite a significant staff. Some of the kinds of donations made by kings and by other political leaders to Brahmins, to temples, to institutions of higher learning, so even then, good idea, we see recorded in inscriptions. So one of the projects we're involved in that Steve mentioned is to systematically document these stone inscriptions. This one's on the side of a temple. Sometimes they're on big slabs. Sometimes they're way out in agricultural fields. And to look at where they are and what kind of information that they give us. So we've worked with epigraphers to study the thousands of these kinds of inscriptions. I'm not any kind of expert about the language part of them, but more about the context. Okay. So that gives you, I hope, a small flavor of the empire at large, right? It's a conquest empire, but one which also operates through a kind of ritual gift-giving and incorporation, and the empire itself was relatively loosely organized. It was not a kind of place with a strong top-down authority. Let's zoom in from the empire now and go to the city itself. If this empire was cosmopolitan, the city of Vijayanagar was definitely also very cosmopolitan. Notwithstanding the fact that it's in the middle of the peninsula in a very dry area, what we see, and the theme of the rise of the city is perfect here, because this is a city that emerged in the early 1300s. By 1565, it was largely completely abandoned, except for some small agricultural villages around it. And yet, by the early 16th century, it was the largest city in Asia. How on earth is that possible? And how did that work? That's one of the questions that we ask in our research. So John Fritz and George Michel divide the city into three different kinds of zones. I hope we can see them here, which they call the urban core. The urban core is kind of this big blob out here. So you can see the Tungabhadra River in blue. The Royal Center, which I've mentioned already, this little square. And then a kind of area where we find the big temple complexes up along the river they call the Sacred Center. I won't talk about each of these in detail, but I do just want to mention that, again, in my point about this being a cosmopolitan city, is that within the urban core, you see specialized kinds of neighborhoods. So there is, for example, what Michel calls the Islamic quarter, and that's an area where we find mosques and evidence of significant number of Muslims living. Much of the standing army was made up of Muslims. And in that area and in a nearby neighborhood at Kadirampur, we also see tombs, Muslim tombs. So it was, although an empire and a city that was very much built on and made explicit reference to various kinds of Hindu traditions and Hindu deities, it was also a place in which many people of many different religions lived and were welcomed and were essential to the operation of the empire. The urban core was surrounded by walls. I love the older photographs, actually, in a way, because everything's in so much better shape. There's a whole series of very important early photographs for those of you who are photography buffs and history of photography. This is the Tulari Ghat Gate you can see on the left. And the gates function not only for military fortification, but also as a way to control the residents of the city going in and out so that various kinds of taxes could be assessed. And the reason I toss up this little gold coin on the right is to remind me to tell you about a significant change in tax policy. I know most of us might have been thinking about significant changes in tax policy recently, but people in the 16th century also had a kind of concern. And what happened then, this is the reign of Krishnadeva Raya, this is the beginning of the time when the city is the biggest, a change was made in how agricultural produce was taxed. And the change was this: prior to this period, anybody who grew a crop, millets, rice, whatever it was, could pay their share of taxes in a portion of the crop. But beginning in the 16th century, in this area, a new rule was promulgated that all taxes had to either be paid in rice or in gold, right? And this is very highly significant, as we'll see, because the kind of land and the kind of possibilities of growing rice are actually very limited. So what this meant was for most people, that is without access, who were not rice growers, without access to rice, they had to participate in a market economy. They had to work for wages, they had to sell something they had grown, they had to do something to get cash to pay their taxes. So this represented a very significant change, and one which really favored those already in power to quite a significant degree. Okay, so within the urban core, still now we're down into the Royal Center. We've already finished the whole urban core. The Royal Center is an area, as you might imagine, the names are a bit fanciful, I will say, but it's certainly an area of elite residence and administration. It's a number of kind of walled compounds with these large, elaborate walls around them. And what's really interesting in a way about this area is the development of a new architectural style. This is a style George Michel calls the Vijayanagar courtly style, but which in the old days was known as the Indo-Saracenic style. And what's really interesting about this style, besides the fact I think that these are really beautiful buildings, is they combine elements of traditional Hindu temple architecture with elements of mosques and other buildings from the Deccan Sultanates. The Deccan Sultanates are the areas just to the north of the Vijaynagar Empire, ruled by Muslim rulers, but again, cosmopolitan population. So sort of elements that you see in contemporaneous Islamic architecture and elements from more sort of long-standing Hindu temple traditions. Here's a few more examples of some of the Vijayanagar courtly style. So it represents this kind of hybrid approach, a kind of new imagination of how to take existing models of legitimacy and rulership and weld them together in a way that makes sense for power. Okay. I want to move on and try to move you towards thinking about food, because this is what I've been working on recently. I mentioned that giving of food to Brahmins, making gifts of food to temples was a very important part of gift giving, but part of that also are large-scale feasts. And these feasts leave an amazing kind of material residue in the city. So what these funny-looking things are actually stone plates or thalis, and the central area is where you put your rice, put your little side dishes on the side, and some of them are even in the shape of banana leaves. Remember the religious leaders eating off of banana leaves in the painting I showed you? So we have evidence of this kind of large-scale feasting, not just in temples, but also in the royal center. Let's move out to the sacred center. Now we're zipping up to the area along the river, the Tungabhadra River. Actually, it's kind of a misnomer. There are sacred buildings everywhere. But the sacred center is the place where we find these massive temple complexes. This is the 16th century Krishna temple complex. And it was a place where Krishnadeva Raya built a temple to accommodate an image of the god Krishna that he won in conquest from a neighboring polity in Orissa. So he wasn't only fighting against Muslim powers, but also against other Hindus, contrary to some of the popular historiography. Here's another, this is my favorite one, I think, the Tiruvingalanatha temple, not just because it's fun to say Tiruvingalanatha, but because there's a tall hill right next to it, and everybody loves this because if you manage to climb up to the top, you can take some exceptional photographs. This gives you a sense, I think, I hope, of the size of these complexes, and you can imagine them in a way as being urban centers themselves. The lands behind the Tiruvingalanatha temple here are now cultivated in bananas for commercial production, but this is an area that would have been primarily, we know in the past, under rice. The role of the Tungabhadra River is extremely important here. This is a very dry region, and the only perennial source of water is the river. You can see the remains of an old bridge, a stone bridge crossing the river. And in the inset photo is very clearly a canal that was built bringing water from the Tungabhadra River out to water areas of intensive water-loving crops such as rice. So one of the things that we've done is documented this very elaborate irrigation infrastructure to understand the forms of production. Okay, so let's think about the city. This is the sort of end of the introductory phase then, this. We have some interesting commentary on the city itself from some of these Portuguese horse traders. The Domingo Paes and Fernando Nunes, who visited the city between 1520 for Paes and 1535 to 7 for Nunes, left us some really quite fabulous comments. This Paes is usually considered to be the more reliable of the two, and he wrote this. I'll record it, so it's very nice. This is him writing. The size of this city I do not write here because it cannot all be seen from one spot. But I climbed a hill whence I could see a great part of it. I could not see all of it because it lies between several ranges of hills. What I saw from thence seemed to me as large as Rome and very beautiful to the sight. And there are many groves and trees within it, in the gardens of the houses, and many conduits of water which flow in the midst of it. And in places there are lakes, and the king has close to his palace a palm grove and other rich-bearing fruit trees. Below the Moorish quarter, that's the Islamic quarter, is a little river, and that's the canal, right? And on this side, there are many orchards and gardens with many fruit trees, and for the most part, mangoes and areca palms and jackfruit trees. And also many lime and orange trees, growing so closely to one another that it appears like a thick forest. And there are also white grapes. And all the water which is in the city comes from the 2 tanks, we'll talk about tanks in a minute, which I have spoken, the first outside the first enclosing wall. The people in this city are countless in number, so much that I do not wish to write it down, for fear it should be thought fabulous. But I declare that no troops, horse or foot, could break their way through any street or lane. So great are the numbers of people and elephants. This is the best provided city in the world. Wow. And this is the forgotten city. How did that happen, right? So this is the, and not, inaccurate view of the city and empire of Vijayanagar. And when I came in 1985, worked in the city, a few years later, thinking about what I was going to do for my dissertation, I started thinking with my colleagues about, okay, we know a lot about the city, but what about the area around it? How is this city situated in its countryside? Where does it get its food, for example? How can PIES say this is the best provided city in the world when we know that it's in one of the most challenging environments in South Asia? The photo here shows you an area away from the river where there's no possibility of canals, gives you a sense of what the landscape sort of normally looks like, in my view. And what you see here is the dam. You can see some of us standing up on top of it here, and a little sluice gate of a reservoir. So the water would have been in the front in the old days. But let's think a little bit about this area. I found a map here that has precipitation in inches, because that's always easier, I think, usually to think about for us. But the area where the nearest weather station is on this map is Bellary, where I put a little pulsing red thing that looks like it didn't come off very well. But in that kind of teardrop-shaped area, we have less than 50 centimeters of annual rainfall. That's one of the very driest parts of India. The only place drier is the Thar Desert in the northwest. How can it be that the best provided city in the world, one of the largest cities in the world, was built in a place which was really so unprepossessing, so problematic for agriculture, very risky even for growing dry farmed crops like millets, okay? So how is this place even here, right? This is the question that we asked when we started a regional survey, my colleagues and I, in the area, or actually originally in the area surrounded by the solid black line. After 2 days of survey, we realized there was so much more out there than we had realized that we quickly rewrote our survey area to be the area inside the red line, and even then it took us 10 years. In any case, we've documented all that area now, in the red and in the black, by systematically walking back and forth and describing all the archaeological remains that we found. Here's just a schematic map showing some of our sample transects and some of the archaeological sites that we found. And I'm not going to talk much about the procedure. I just want to tell you a little bit about what we've learned about the history of these 300 years in the area surrounding the city of Vijayanagar in a kind of nutshell. So remember, we have 300 years, 14th century, 15th century, 16th century. Here's the condensed version. In the 14th century, when the city was first established, in an area where there really hadn't been any kind of significant settlement, we see a focus on irrigated agriculture, the construction of canals, and the effort to bring water from the Tungabhadra River to places where there will be perennial, that is year-round irrigation. So there is one reservoir watered by canal. You can see my colleague Mark Lysett and I taking a pollen core from behind the sluice gate there from underneath the water, and a little temple built on the side of the canal. So we see an effort in the early days of the city. People stayed up very close to the river, and they were particularly interested in being able to grow rice and other kinds of irrigated crops. Right? And we already know that rice and other irrigated crops are very important for presentation to temples, to Brahmins, and so on. I just skipped the 15th century because it's kind of boring. So we'll go on to the 16th century, right? So the 16th, not much happened, but it's kind of interesting too. In the 16th century, things went wild. This is why I use the word megalopolis, actually. The little city of Vijaynagar expanded. It was massive urban sprawl. Just took in little villages and gobbled them up and became kind of, suburbs all around them. And one of the ways that we can document this, besides looking at the archaeological remains and spending decades, which we actually did, was to look at the evidence from the texts, from the inscriptions. And what this little diagram shows you is actually just the number of inscriptions from different time periods. So it's a kind of a rough measure of how many gifts were given at different times. And you can see that this very tall peak that I have circled is the peak for the 16th century. So the 14th century is that first kind of more diffuse peak when the city was first established. I told you the 15th century was boring, that's the trough in the middle. And then the 16th century, all of a sudden, people went wild. There was a massive population expansion in the city, lots of construction. The empire expanded its bounds quite significantly. And we can see this impact on the landscape, which is what I'm kind of interested in. So during the 16th century, as population grew, as demands for produce grew, we see two kinds of changes in agricultural production. One is an expansion of the already existing wet or irrigated agricultural regimes, and the other is more of a move into dry farming and farming supported by reservoirs, runoff-fed reservoirs, so only rainfall. So it's an area with very low annual rainfall, where the rainfall is highly seasonal. So you either catch it or you don't, right? So what we can see, if you look at the little map to the left, that area in yellow is the area where canal irrigation was possible and where canals were. But the area to the outside, much of the, most of the area is actually under dry farming or cultivation under runoff-fed reservoirs. Those are little red blobs. This is an abandoned dam of a runoff-fed reservoir in one of the outlying valleys around the city. You can see a person standing up at the top, but it's completely defunct. So in the 16th century, people continued trying to grow rice and other crops that needed a lot of water. This one in some ways is my favorite. It's a 16th century aqueduct that was built to carry water from a canal for fields on a tiny little island in the river. That island, the amount of land that you could grow rice is not much bigger than this auditorium. So building an aqueduct for that is really a sign, I think, of the very high value that's placed on those certain kinds of crops. That particular canal that fed that aqueduct is a canal which takes off from the Tungabhadra River, which, as you can see, looking down on it, has a kind of a braided course. There's a very clever kind of engineering device that emerges around this time, known as the anacut. The anacut is like a kind of little low wall, and you can build it up and down. And I put little red arrows along it to show you it's a wall which is pulling water off of one of the channels of the Tungabhadra River to feed the Anagundi channel, which waters an area of rice and goes up onto that aqueduct. So this is more than 3 kilometers long, this anacut, and is still functional today. So there is a kind of interesting engineering story to be told also about this expansion of agricultural facilities. So, but beyond those areas where you can grow rice and when there's a lot of water and you're in reach of the river, the yellow areas, way out there in the white and the red, it's very dry, it's very risky for growing any crops, even the kind of crops, millets and pulses that are hardy and adapted to that area. So again, here's a runoff-fed reservoir. I think it's probably the same one I showed you before because it's one of my favorites. But let me just say quickly how they work. Okay. Francis Buchanan, who was a British colonial officer sent out to do a review of this area right after the British captured it in 1799, 1800, was as taken with reservoirs as I am. So after Buchanan, I think nobody but me thought reservoirs were thrilling. So you can see my drawing of a reservoir on the right and Francis Buchanan's on the left. The way they work is they have a large dam or embankment. This is a cross-section. And there are tunnels which are built underneath the reservoir, generally lined with stone. And there's a sluice in the front. You can see that I put water in my sluice. And the sluice there's a hole, and you can put a plug in it, just like the plug in a bathtub drain, basically. So you can put the plug, if you pull the plug up, water goes underneath the dam to channels down below, put the plug in, water fills up. It's a very simple technology, but it's one which is really peculiar, really particular to southern India and Sri Lanka. And there are hundreds of thousands of reservoirs built in this part of the world at this time. I'm just going to show you one more reservoir, which is great. I think it's really shows a lot of forbearance on my part. A really cute little reservoir, the Malapanagudi Reservoir. You can see it's got a little staircase that goes down. This is where the water would have been here. You can also like wash your clothes and things in the reservoir. And here you can see the sluice, and this one's very charming for many reasons, but in part because what we can see on the outside, looking out across the water, are donor portraits. So this is from the boring 15th century, but it has these donor portraits. So they are portraits of the well-to-do people who paid for or paid in part for the construction of this reservoir. So much the way the Penn Museum asks you to buy a seat in the auditorium, right? You could do the same kind of thing with reservoirs, right? So there's a whole kind of political economy of donation and presentation, which is very important here. And if you can look carefully, you see a woman on the right doing a little namaste, and then on the left, the male donor, sorry, he's a little dark, but look at his head. He's wearing one of those pointy hats, okay? So those pointy hats are called kulai, and they are a kind of fad, you might say, a kind of fashion fad among all the elites and really the in guys in medieval southern India around this period, but it's a kind of a Muslim thing. Right? So the Vijaynagar kings may have patronized Hindu temples and given gifts to Brahmins and so on, but they also practiced many kinds of courtly behavior and modes of dress, ceremonies and things which were part of a kind of pan-Indic political sphere, and part of that includes the little hats. Okay, how do we know about all this? I mentioned the historical data, I mentioned the archaeological data, and I'm not going to get into any detail about this, but I do just want to also say that one of the other things that we've done is to study plant remains, both plant remains from within archaeological settlements and outside of them, in order to reconstruct the vegetation and the environment and food during this time. So here I am in 2014 down the bottom of a hole collecting pollen samples for analysis to look at vegetation change. Here are a couple of my students a few years ago in an excavation of an archaeological site in this area with a long sequence looking at houses and food and the way in which it's changed through time. So I want to sort of now move into the last and final stage of the talk and talking about food and how choices about food and choices about food which are both social and political choices have really long-term consequences. So it's not unfamiliar to us, I think now, the idea that the food choices we make might have an impact on the planet. Although when I started studying this, it was always a little bit of a shock to students when I would say, these food choices have an impact on the planet. Now the students tell me, did you know that your food choices have impact on the planet? So maybe it's old hat in some ways. And if many people are not familiar with Vijayanagar or the Vijaynagar Empire, perhaps many people in the US are also not very familiar with South Indian food. A lot of the Indian food you get in restaurants in the US is not South Indian food. It's a kind of Mughal, North Indian, Punjabi sort of thing. But South Indian food is an absolutely glorious thing. And here is a kind of classic South Indian meal on a banana leaf, And one thing I want to point out about this is that this meal itself has a kind of history. So one of the things my team and I have been working on is the development of what we call elite cuisines in southern India. And in South India now, people will say that's not elite cuisine, that's just food, that's just normal food, right? But that's not actually true. Starting around the 10th century CE, we start to see the development of codified elite cuisines, of recipes, of regional variabilities. And if you look at this banana leaf, and if you look at all of the kinds of ingredients on it, I'll give you a list in a minute, what you have to understand is that each one of those ingredients represents a huge amount of water and a huge amount of labor. Pretty much everything in the elite meal is the product of irrigation, right? Particularly in these very dry regions where it's not possible to grow rice or bananas or sugar without artificial irrigation, okay? So by the 10th century, and certainly during the Vijayanagar period, we start to see a radical divide between the food of poor people and the food of rich people. And what you have to understand about the food of rich people is that it's also the food of gods. Gods eat the same thing as rich people, for the most part. So they will have to be offered certain kinds of meals, rice and so on, whereas the food of poor people on the left, you can see, for the most part, more dry. It's based on different kinds of crops altogether, and here, let me give you a bit of a contrast. The elite, you notice I'm keeping elite on the right all the time. Elite rice-based cuisines are based on rice. Ooh, I didn't even mean that. Ooh, but I like it, okay. So we can see things like rice, coconuts, bananas, ghee or clarified butter, which obviously is a animal product, spices and aromatics. These tend to be very wet, so that you need these dishes, the thalis that have rims are kind of soupy, and they're also built on irrigated agriculture. I always kind of like to think of these little soupy dishes as being like little rice paddies themselves, you know. On the other hand, ordinary food, even now, less so than it used to be, but in rural areas, is millet-based. People eat various kinds of dry millet-based breads. Instead of dairy products, they tend to more use oil seeds like sesame or castor, which can be grown in dry farms. They have much less use of spices and aromatics, the relatively dry preparations, and also sheep and goat instead of cattle. So there's quite a significant difference. And by the time of the Vijayanagar period, this is already very much manifest, okay? So let me just show you again one more. I showed you some thalis, stone thalis from Vijayanagar. This is from a Vijayanagar period temple at Lapakshi. And you can see just how similar